If my son had listened to me, he never would have married you. Those were the words I said to my daughter-in-law on a Thanksgiving afternoon, and even now, years later, I can still see the look on her face when I said them. Rachel Carter stood at the end of my dining table, holding a bowl of mashed potatoes she had spent hours preparing. The room had been filled with family, laughter, and the smell of roasted turkey. Then I opened my mouth and changed everything. The conversation stopped. My son Jordan lowered his eyes. Rachel remained completely still for a moment before quietly placing the bowl on the table. She did not argue. She did not cry. She did not defend herself. She simply nodded once and continued helping serve dinner as though nothing had happened. Looking back, that was what made it worse. If she had shouted at me, I could have justified my anger. If she had stormed out, I could have blamed her. Instead, she showed me a grace I did not deserve. At the time, however, I saw none of it. My name is Eleanor Carter. I was 67 years old when I finally began telling myself the truth, but the story started much earlier. Ever since my husband passed away, my son had become the center of my world. Jordan was not just my child. He was my closest friend, my source of comfort, and the person who helped me survive the loneliest years of my life. When Rachel entered his life, I convinced myself she was taking him away from me. It did not matter how kind she was. It did not matter how hard she tried. I had already decided who she was before I truly knew her. Every birthday card she sent felt forced to me. Every family dinner she organized felt like an attempt to impress people. Every thoughtful gesture seemed suspicious. Looking back now, I realized the problem was never Rachel. The problem was my fear. Fear has a way of disguising itself as judgment. It tells you that you are protecting something valuable, when in reality, you are slowly pushing people away. Rachel never gave me a reason to dislike her. She remembered my favorite flowers. She called on holidays. She brought homemade soup whenever I caught a cold. She always asked how I was feeling. Yet, somehow I managed to find fault in everything she did. If she arrived early, I called her controlling. If she arrived late, I called her irresponsible. If she offered help, I told myself she was showing off. If she stayed quiet, I accused her of being distant. Nothing she did was ever enough because I had already decided she could never be enough. Jordan noticed it, of course. Everyone did. There were awkward silences at family gatherings. Uncomfortable looks exchanged across dinner tables. More than once my son asked me to give Rachel a chance. More than once I promised I would try. But each time I failed. The truth is that I wanted Rachel to prove me wrong while refusing to give her any opportunity to do so. Year after year, she kept showing up. Year after year, I kept finding new reasons to keep her at arm's length. Then came the Thanksgiving afternoon I would never forget. The afternoon I said the cruelest thing I had ever said to another human being. The afternoon Rachel looked at me with quiet sadness instead of anger. At the time, I thought I had won some invisible battle. I thought I had protected my place in my son's life. What I did not know was that life was about to teach me a lesson far more painful than anything I had ever experienced. And when that lesson arrived, the person I had treated worse than anyone else would become the one person I could not live without. After that Thanksgiving dinner, life continued the way it always had on the surface. Family gatherings still happened. Birthdays came and went. Holidays filled the calendar. Yet something had changed, and even I could feel it. Rachel remained polite, but a quiet distance had settled between us. She still called me on holidays. She still remembered my birthday. She still asked whether I needed anything from the grocery store. The difference was that she no longer seemed hopeful. For years, she had approached every conversation as if she believed we might eventually become family. After that afternoon, she seemed to understand what I refused to admit. I had built a wall between us, and I was the only person who could take it down. The strange thing was that Rachel never stopped trying to be kind. A week before Christmas, she dropped off homemade cookies at my house. I thanked her and immediately complained that they were too sweet. On Mother's Day, she sent flowers. I told Jordan they were probably chosen by an assistant. When she invited me to dinner, I criticized the restaurant. Looking back now, I cannot remember a single thing Rachel did wrong. I can remember dozens of things I convinced myself were wrong because I wanted them to be. Jordan tried to reason with me more than once. One evening, he sat across from me at my kitchen table while the sun disappeared beyond the backyard fence. He looked tired, older than I was used to seeing him. "Mom," he said quietly, "Rachel really cares about you." I remember rolling my eyes. She cares because she wants people to think she does. Jordan leaned back in his chair and sighed. Do you hear yourself? At the time, I became defensive. I told him he was blinded by love. I told him he could not see what I saw. The truth was exactly the opposite. I was the one who could not see clearly. My son eventually stopped arguing. That hurt more than I admitted. There was a time when he told me everything. Now he carefully avoided certain topics because he knew where the conversation would lead. Rachel never complained about me to him, at least not that I knew of. If anything, she protected me. More than once I overheard Jordan apologizing to her for my behavior. Every time she responded the same way. She is your mother. No anger. No bitterness. Just patience. Months turned into years. Rachel built a successful career. She volunteered at local events. She remembered every family birthday. She sent cards. She organized gatherings. She even helped neighbors when they needed support. Everywhere she went, people seemed to appreciate her. Everyone except me. Sometimes I wonder whether part of me resented how easily she connected with others. She had a warmth that drew people in. I had spent years pushing people away. Deep down, perhaps I knew the difference. One summer afternoon, I attended a neighborhood fundraiser and noticed Rachel helping an elderly woman carry supplies to her car. The woman hugged her before leaving. Later, another volunteer thanked Rachel for spending weekends helping at community events. People smiled when they saw her. They trusted her. As I drove home that evening, an uncomfortable thought crossed my mind. What if everyone else was seeing something I refused to see? The thought disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived. Pride is a powerful thing. It convinces you that admitting a mistake would somehow make you weaker. So I continued living exactly as I always had. Then one cold January morning, everything changed. I woke up feeling exhausted. At first I blamed the weather. Then I blamed my age. But as the weeks passed, simple tasks became harder. Walking upstairs left me short of breath. Grocery shopping felt unusually difficult. Even carrying laundry from one room to another seemed to require more effort than it should. Eventually, Jordan insisted I see a doctor. I argued. I delayed. I made excuses. But deep inside, I already knew something was wrong. What I did not know was that the diagnosis waiting for me would force me to depend on other people in ways I never imagined. And when that moment arrived, the people I expected to be there would not be the ones sitting beside me. The doctor delivered the news on a gray February afternoon. Outside the clinic window, snow rested along the sidewalks while cold sunlight reflected off parked cars. Inside the examination room, everything felt strangely quiet. I sat on the edge of the chair listening as the physician explained my condition. It was serious enough to require ongoing treatment, frequent monitoring, and significant lifestyle changes. I remember nodding as he spoke, but very little of what he said truly registered. When people imagine receiving difficult medical news, they often picture dramatic moments. For me, it felt different. It felt like watching a door slowly close somewhere far away. The drive home was silent. I turned off the radio and spent most of the trip staring at the road ahead. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the house looked different somehow. Smaller, lonelier. For years I had lived independently and taken pride in needing very little help from anyone. Now for the first time in a long time, I felt uncertain. Jordan came over that evening. He sat with me at the kitchen table while I explained what the doctor had said. The concern on his face was impossible to miss. He immediately began discussing appointments, treatment schedules, transportation plans, and ways to make life easier. Rachel sat beside him listening carefully. She carried a notebook and quietly wrote down details as we talked. Every so often she asked thoughtful questions I had not considered. Which medications might affect my energy levels? Whether I would need help with groceries? How often follow-up visits would be required? I noticed all of it, but I refused to acknowledge how helpful she was being. Instead, I focused on Jordan. That had always been easier. Over the following weeks, my life became a series of appointments and adjustments. Some days were manageable. Others left me exhausted. Tasks I once completed without thinking suddenly required planning. The hardest part was not the physical discomfort. It was the loss of independence. Accepting help felt like admitting weakness. Whenever Jordan offered assistance, I insisted I could manage. Whenever neighbors checked on me, I assured them everything was fine. Yet the truth became harder to hide. One afternoon, I became so tired carrying groceries from my car that I had to sit on the front steps for nearly 20 minutes before I could finish bringing them inside. Another morning, I missed an appointment because I forgot to write it on my calendar. Little mistakes began adding up. Jordan noticed immediately. So did Rachel. They started calling more frequently. They offered to drive me places. They volunteered to help around the house. Most of the time I resisted. Pride remained one of the few things I still felt I controlled. Then came the conversation that changed everything. Jordan received an unexpected opportunity through his company. A major project required several months of travel across multiple states. It was the kind of assignment that could transform his career. I could see how conflicted he felt when he told me. Part of him wanted to stay close to home. Part of him knew he could not ignore the opportunity. I surprised both of us by encouraging him to go. I told him I would be fine. I insisted I could take care of myself. Eventually, he agreed. The night before he left, the three of us shared dinner together. The atmosphere felt uneasy despite everyone's efforts to keep things light. Jordan worried about me. I worried about him. Rachel listened quietly from across the table. Before leaving, Jordan looked directly at her and said something I would not fully understand until much later. Please do not feel responsible for everything. Rachel smiled softly and reached for his hand. I know, but there was something in her expression that suggested she had already made a decision. At the time, I did not think much about it. I assumed life would continue the same way it always had. I assumed friends would visit. Neighbors would check in. Family members would call. I assumed support would naturally appear when I needed it. What I did not realize was how quickly promises fade when life becomes inconvenient. And what I could not yet see was that the person I trusted least was quietly preparing to become the person I would depend on most. The first few weeks after Jordan left were not as difficult as I expected. Friends called. Neighbors stopped by. Family members checked in. My phone rang often enough that I convinced myself nothing had really changed. Whenever someone asked whether I needed help, I automatically answered no. Old habits are difficult to break. I still wanted to believe I was the same person I had always been. Strong, independent, self-sufficient. Yet little by little, reality began proving otherwise. The calls became less frequent. The visits became shorter. Everyone had jobs, responsibilities, children, and lives of their own. Nobody was being cruel. They were simply busy. That is what happens when a crisis lasts longer than people expect. Concern slowly turns into routine. Promises become harder to keep. One rainy Tuesday morning, I woke up feeling especially tired. My refrigerator was nearly empty, and I knew I needed groceries. After staring at the ceiling for almost an hour, I finally forced myself out of bed and drove to the store. What should have been a simple errand took nearly 3 hours. By the time I returned home, I felt exhausted. I sat in my car staring at the grocery bags in the back seat, wondering how I was going to carry everything inside. Then a knock sounded against the passenger window. I looked up and immediately felt my shoulders tense. Rachel stood outside holding an umbrella. I had no idea how she knew I was there. She opened the rear door before I could protest and began lifting bags. I can handle that, I said through the cracked window. Rachel smiled politely. I know you can. Then she continued carrying groceries toward the house. Somehow that answer irritated me even more than if she had argued. Over the next several days, the same thing kept happening. Whenever there was a medical appointment, Rachel somehow knew about it. Whenever I needed prescriptions picked up, Rachel appeared. If a snowstorm was forecast, she called to check whether I had enough food. If I mentioned a problem in passing during a conversation with Jordan, Rachel seemed to know about it before the day ended. At first, I assumed Jordan was asking her to help. That explanation made sense. But one evening during a phone call, I mentioned how much Rachel had been doing. Jordan sounded surprised. She has not told me much about it, he said. I thought you were mostly managing on your own. After we hung up, I sat quietly in my living room thinking about that response. If Rachel was helping because Jordan asked her to, she would have made sure he knew. Instead, she seemed determined to keep her efforts invisible. A week later, I had an early morning medical appointment across town. The weather was cold, and freezing rain coated the roads. I walked outside expecting to drive myself. Instead, Rachel's car was already parked in the driveway. She stepped out holding a travel mug of coffee. Good morning, she said. I stared at her. What are you doing here? Driving you to your appointment. You have work. I took the morning off. The answer bothered me more than it should have. Nobody had ever used vacation time for me before. Not willingly. During the drive, we spent most of the time in silence. Rachel never pressured me into conversation. She never acted like a hero. She simply drove through the rain while soft music played quietly through the speakers. When we arrived at the clinic, She waited in the lobby while I met with my doctor. 2 hours later, she was still there, reading a book, drinking coffee, looking completely content to spend her day helping someone who had spent years rejecting her kindness. As we drove home, I found myself watching her differently, not as my son's wife, not as the person I blamed for taking him away, just as a person who continued showing up even when she had every reason not to. And for the first time in many years, a question entered my mind that I could not ignore. What if I had been wrong about Rachel all along? That question followed me everywhere. What if I had been wrong about Rachel all along? At first I tried to ignore it. Pride does not disappear overnight. It lingers. It searches for excuses. It looks for reasons to avoid uncomfortable truths. Every time Rachel helped me, part of me still searched for hidden motives. Yet the longer my illness continued, the harder those excuses became to find. One afternoon, I returned home after another medical appointment feeling completely drained. The house was quiet except for the sound of rain tapping gently against the windows. I lowered myself into my favorite chair and fell asleep without even turning on a lamp. When I woke up nearly 2 hours later, a warm meal sat on the kitchen counter covered with foil. Beside it was a handwritten note. Heat for 2 minutes. Call if you need anything. Rachel. That was all. No speech. No reminder that she had helped me. No attempt to earn gratitude. Just a simple note. I stood in the kitchen staring at those words longer than I care to admit. The next week brought another difficult stretch. My energy levels dropped lower than usual, and several appointments were added to my schedule. Friends who had promised to visit canceled because of work obligations. A cousin who lived nearby called to say she would stop by and never did. Even some neighbors who used to check on me regularly became less visible. Again, nobody was trying to be unkind. Life simply moved on. Meanwhile, Rachel continued appearing with remarkable consistency. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, weekends, rain or sunshine, busy days or quiet ones. Somehow she always found time. Sometimes she brought groceries. Sometimes she drove me to appointments. Sometimes she simply sat at the kitchen table drinking tea while we talked about ordinary things. Gradually, something unexpected happened. The silence between us began to disappear. We started having real conversations. I learned things about Rachel I should have known years earlier. I learned that she had grown up helping care for her grandmother. I learned that she volunteered at a community food pantry several weekends each month. I learned that she loved gardening and had transformed a neglected corner of her backyard into a beautiful flower garden. Most importantly, I learned that she possessed a quiet strength I had completely overlooked. She rarely complained. She rarely sought attention. She simply did what needed to be done. One evening we sat together on my back porch watching the sunset paint the sky shades of gold and orange. The air felt warm for the first time since winter. Rachel handed me a blanket when the temperature began dropping. "Thank you," I said automatically. The words surprised both of us. Not because gratitude was unusual, because it was one of the first sincere thank yous I had ever given her. Rachel smiled softly. "You are welcome." Neither of us mentioned the significance of the moment. Yet I felt it. A small crack had appeared in the wall I spent years building. A few days later, Jordan called from another state. We spoke for nearly an hour. Before ending the conversation, he asked how I was doing. For the first time, I told him the truth. "Rachel has been helping me a lot." There was silence on the line. Then he laughed quietly. "I know." "How?" I asked. "Because that is who she is." After we hung up, I sat alone in my living room thinking about those words. Because that is who she is. The simplicity of the statement struck me. Rachel was not helping because she wanted approval. She was not helping because she expected something. In return, she was helping because kindness was part of her character. The realization filled me with an uncomfortable mix of gratitude and shame. Every memory from the past began replaying differently in my mind. The flowers, the phone calls, the invitations, the holidays, the countless moments I had dismissed or criticized. For years I believed I was judging Rachel accurately. Now I was beginning to understand that I had never truly seen her at all. And as that realization settled deeper into my heart, another truth slowly emerged beside it. The person I needed to forgive might not be Rachel. The person I needed to confront was myself. The hardest part of illness is not always the pain. Sometimes it is the silence. Sometimes it is the long afternoons when the house feels too large and every room reminds you how much life has changed. By early summer, my treatment had become part of a routine. Appointments filled my calendar. Medication bottles lined the kitchen counter. Some days were better than others. On good days, I could almost pretend everything was normal. On difficult days, even getting dressed felt like a challenge. Through all of it, Rachel remained a constant presence. Not in an overwhelming way. Not in a way that made me feel helpless. She simply seemed to know when I needed support and when I needed space. One Thursday afternoon, I sat alone in my living room watching sunlight move slowly across the hardwood floor. The house was unusually quiet. My energy was low, and I had canceled plans with a neighbor earlier that morning. For reasons I could not fully explain, I found myself opening an old photo album. Dust drifted through the warm light as I turned the pages. There was my wedding day. There was Jordan as a little boy holding a baseball glove nearly as large as he was. There were family vacations, birthdays, and holidays stretching across decades. Then I came to a photograph taken several years earlier. It showed Jordan and Rachel standing together at a family barbecue. Rachel was smiling. Jordan had his arm around her shoulder. I stared at the picture for a long time. What struck me was not the image itself. It was the memory attached to it. I remembered that day. I remembered criticizing the dessert Rachel brought. I remembered finding fault with something completely insignificant. Looking at the photograph now, I could not understand why. The version of myself in that memory felt like a stranger. A few minutes later, a soft knock sounded at the front door. Rachel stepped inside carrying 2 bags of groceries and a small bouquet of yellow flowers. I saw these and thought they would brighten the kitchen, she said. I accepted the flowers without speaking. For some reason, emotion had settled heavily in my chest. Rachel placed the groceries on the counter and immediately noticed the open photo album. "Those are wonderful pictures," she said. I nodded. I have been looking through old memories. Rachel smiled gently. Sometimes that can be a dangerous activity. The comment made me laugh for the first time all day. She sat down across from me at the dining table. Sunlight streamed through the nearby window, casting warm patterns across the wood surface. For several moments, we simply sat there in comfortable silence. Then I asked a question that had been bothering me for weeks. "Why did you keep trying?" Rachel looked confused. "Trying what?" "Trying with me." The smile disappeared from her face. She understood immediately. I looked down at my hands. I was not easy to love. Rachel remained quiet for several seconds. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm. "No, you were not." The honesty surprised me, yet there was no anger behind it. Only truth. She folded her hands together. "But you were important to Jordan." I felt my throat tighten. Rachel continued softly. "And whether you believed it or not, you were important to me too." The room seemed impossibly still. Outside, a breeze moved through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a lawn-mower hummed. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary moments. Yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. For years I had assumed Rachel stayed because she had to. Because she was being polite. Because she was fulfilling some obligation. Sitting there across from her, I finally understood how wrong I had been. Rachel stayed because she chose to stay. Not because she owed me kindness. Because kindness was simply who she was. And as that realization settled into my heart, I felt something begin to break loose inside me. Years of pride. Years of resentment. Years of excuses. For the first time, I was no longer trying to justify my behavior. I was finally ready to face it. And deep down, I knew a day was coming when I would have to say the words I should have said years earlier. A few weeks after that conversation, I learned something that changed me forever. It happened by accident. Rachel had stopped by one afternoon to drop off groceries before heading back to work. She left her planner on the kitchen counter and did not realize it until she had already driven away. I noticed it while cleaning up after lunch. My first instinct was to call her immediately, but curiosity got the better of me when I saw my name written several times across the open page. I know I should have looked away. Instead, I glanced down. What I found left me speechless. Appointment reminders. Medication schedules. Notes about foods my doctor recommended. Phone numbers for specialists. Dates of follow-up visits. Every detail of my care had been carefully organized. Page after page contained information about me. What shocked me most was not the effort itself. It was a small note written beside one of my appointments. Use personal vacation day. I turned another page. More notes appeared. Leave work early. Reschedule meeting. Cancel weekend plans. My hands began to tremble. Rachel had never mentioned any of it. Not once. Later that evening, after she returned for the planner, I asked her a simple question. "How many vacation days have you used helping me?" Rachel looked surprised. Then she looked down. It does not matter. It matters to me. She hesitated. Most of them. The answer hit me harder than any diagnosis ever had. Most of them. While I had spent years criticizing her, she had quietly used the time meant for rest and family to help take care of me. I sat down at the kitchen table because suddenly my legs felt weak. Rachel immediately moved closer, concern filling her face. Are you all right? The question nearly broke my heart. Even then, she was worried about me. Not herself. Me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting soft patterns across the floor. The kitchen felt smaller somehow. More honest. There was no place left for excuses. No place left for pride. Everything I had spent years believing was falling apart in front of me. Why? I finally whispered. Rachel looked confused. Why what? Why would you do all of this after the way I treated you? The room became very quiet. Rachel pulled out a chair and sat across from me. Her expression remained calm, thoughtful, patient. The same expression she had worn through years of criticism. Because you are family, she said softly. I lowered my eyes. Tears blurred my vision before I could stop them. Family. I had spent years refusing to treat her like family. Yet she never stopped treating me like family. Every cruel word returned to me. Every unfair judgment. Every holiday gathering. Every opportunity one wasted. The weight of it all became impossible to ignore. Rachel reached across the table and gently placed her hand over mine. The gesture contained no resentment, no triumph, only compassion. That made it even harder. I am sorry, I said, but the words felt far too small. Rachel squeezed my hand gently. You do not have to do this right now. Yes, I said through tears. I do. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to see the truth completely. Rachel was not the woman who took my son away. She was the woman who stood beside him. She was not the outsider I imagined. She was the person who had been trying to belong from the very beginning. And sitting there in the warm afternoon light, holding the hand of the woman I had hurt so many times, I realized the greatest mistake of my life was not that I misjudged her. It was that I wasted so many years refusing to love someone who had been loving me all along. After that afternoon, something changed between us. The change was not dramatic. There was no grand speech. No instant transformation. Real life rarely works that way. Instead, it happened through small moments. Quiet moments. Honest moments. The kind that slowly rebuild trust after years of damage. A few days after discovering how much Rachel had sacrificed, I found myself sitting alone in my living room thinking about everything I wanted to say. The problem was that words felt inadequate. How do you apologize for years of unfairness? How do you undo countless moments of rejection? Every sentence I rehearsed sounded too small compared to the weight of what I owed her. Eventually, I realized there was only one thing I could do. I had to tell the truth. A week later, Jordan returned home from his work assignment. I will never forget the look on his face when he walked through my front door. Relief. Happiness. Exhaustion. For months he had worried about me from hundreds of miles away. Now he was finally home. Rachel stood beside him carrying an overnight bag. The sight of them together filled me with emotions I could not fully explain. For years I had viewed their relationship as something that took my son away from me. Now I understood it was one of the reasons he had become the man I was proud of. That evening the three of us shared dinner around my kitchen table. The atmosphere felt different than it had in years. Lighter. More comfortable. We laughed. We told stories. We talked about ordinary things. Yet the words I needed to say remained waiting inside me. Finally, as dessert plates sat untouched on the table, I looked directly at Rachel. My hands trembled slightly. There is something I need to tell you. The room became quiet. Rachel immediately set down her fork. Jordan looked back and forth between us. I took a deep breath. I spent years judging you without giving you a fair chance. My voice cracked. I convinced myself you were the problem when the truth was that I was afraid. Tears filled my eyes before I could stop them. I was afraid of losing my son. And instead of dealing with that fear honestly, I took it out on you. Rachel remained silent. Not cold. Not distant. Simply listening. I continued. You showed me kindness over and over again, and I responded with criticism. You offered friendship, and I pushed you away. You treated me like family long before I treated you like family. Jordan lowered his eyes. The room felt impossibly still. I am sorry, I whispered. I am more sorry than I can ever explain. For several seconds nobody spoke. Then Rachel stood up and walked around the table. My heart pounded. She knelt beside my chair and gently wrapped her arms around me. I broke down completely. Years of regret poured out in tears I could no longer hold back. Rachel held me without hesitation, without resentment, without making me earn forgiveness. When she finally pulled back, her eyes were wet too. "I forgave you a long time ago," she said softly. The words hit me harder than anything else. A long time ago, while I was still holding on to pride, she had already chosen grace. While I was building walls, she had already opened a door. Later that night, after Jordan and Rachel left, I sat alone on my back porch watching the stars appear one by one above the neighborhood. The summer air felt warm against my skin. For the first time in years, my heart felt lighter. Not because the past had disappeared. The past would always be there. But because the truth no longer lived in silence. Rachel knew how deeply sorry I was. And somehow, despite everything, she had chosen to meet my regret with compassion. Sitting there beneath the quiet sky, I realized something beautiful. Forgiveness does not erase what happened. It creates the possibility of something new. And for the first time in many years, I felt hopeful about the future waiting ahead of us. 1 year later, Thanksgiving arrived again. The morning sunlight spilled through my kitchen windows, illuminating counters covered with dishes, pies, and family recipes passed down through generations. The house smelled of roasted turkey, cinnamon, and fresh bread. Laughter drifted in from the living room where relatives had already begun gathering. It was the same holiday that once held one of my greatest regrets. Yet somehow everything felt different. Life had not magically become perfect. My health still required attention. Some days remained difficult, but I was stronger than I had been a year earlier, both physically and emotionally. More importantly, my family felt whole in a way I had not experienced in a very long time. Throughout the morning, people arrived carrying food and exchanging hugs. Jordan moved through the house, helping wherever he was needed. Watching him laugh with relatives filled me with gratitude. There had been a time when I feared losing my son. What I finally learned was that love does not shrink when it is shared. It grows. Rachel arrived shortly before noon carrying a homemade pie. The moment she stepped through the front door, several family members greeted her warmly. She smiled and laughed as she made her way into the kitchen. For a moment, I simply stood there watching. Not because she was doing anything extraordinary, because she belonged. The realization filled me with a quiet happiness that is difficult to describe. There was a time when I viewed her as an outsider. Now I could not imagine our family without her. As guests settled around the dining table later that afternoon, I found myself remembering another Thanksgiving years earlier. The painful words, the silence that followed, the look on Rachel's face. The memory still hurt, but it no longer carried the same weight. Not because I had forgotten it, because Rachel had given me the opportunity to become someone better than the person who spoke those words. The meal began. Conversation flowed easily. Stories bounced from one side of the table to the other. Children laughed. Glasses clinked softly. The late afternoon sun painted the dining room in warm golden light. Then, as everyone prepared to begin eating, I stood from my chair. The room gradually became quiet. Several relatives looked toward me with curious expressions. Jordan paused in the middle of a conversation. Rachel looked up from across the table. My heart pounded slightly. Not from fear. From gratitude. I lifted my glass and smiled. "Before we eat, there is something I want to say." The room fell completely silent. I looked directly at Rachel. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I continued. "A year ago, I learned what real family looks like." Emotion tightened my throat. When life became difficult, when I needed help, when I was not always easy to care for, one person showed up again and again without being asked. Several family members glanced toward Rachel. She immediately looked embarrassed. I smiled. She gave her time, her patience, her kindness, and her heart. My eyes filled with tears, and she did it for someone who did not always deserve it. The room remained silent except for the soft hum of the heating vent. I took a slow breath. Then I said the words I wished I had said years earlier. "Rachel, I want everyone here to know something." She looked up. The afternoon sunlight caught the tears forming in her eyes. "You are not my daughter-in-law." My voice trembled. "You are my daughter." For a second, nobody moved. Then Rachel covered her mouth as tears slipped down her cheeks. Jordan lowered his head and smiled. Around the table, several relatives wiped their eyes. Rachel stood and walked around the table toward me. I opened my arms, and she stepped into a hug that felt years overdue. The room filled with quiet applause and soft laughter. Yet what I remember most is not the applause, not the tears, not even the words themselves. It was the feeling that settled over the room afterward. Peace. The kind of peace that comes when truth finally replaces pride. As evening arrived and golden light faded beyond the windows, family conversations resumed around the table. Rachel sat beside me, Jordan across from us. Laughter echoed through the house. And for the first time in many years, I looked around at the people I loved and understood something simple but powerful. The greatest gift I received during my illness was not recovery. It was the chance to recognize the extraordinary person who had been standing beside my family all along.